The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, La Crosse's West Avenue was the heart of an upper-class residential district. The blocks between Cass and Main Streets were decorated with palatial homes so magnificent they were adorned with names. In autumn of 1921, a new neighbor arrived on West Avenue. When Adelbert Miller decided to move to the residence at 134 West Avenue South, previously known as the Platts Homestead, he could not have predicted the stir it would cause. The home was purchased by Adelbert's wife, Sophia, in November of 1920, and the couple eagerly began to prepare the home for business. The La Crosse Tribune reported that, quote, "The house has been handsomely decorated and furnished. The chapel on the main floor, with large bay windows and handsome furnishings, is a particularly attractive suite of rooms." However, just 3 days after moving in, it became clear that A.J. Miller's enterprise would not be warmly welcomed into this fancy neighborhood. Miller received a written protest from his new well-to-do neighbors, expressing their concern for the presence of his business. It was unsightly, it depressed them, it depreciated the value of their homes, it drove them to hysterics. Miller had not just set up any old shop in his new home. It was something so unsightly, so haunting, so uncouth, that Miller's neighbors had no choice but to pursue legal action the summer of 1921. This was only the beginning of a 2-year battle with the West Avenue residents, a battle that would end in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, setting a precedent for the state in years to come. It all began in the La Crosse County Circuit Court, and it was all about a funeral home.
We're here at the courthouse today asking the questions. Does the location of undertaking rooms in a residence located in the heart of a desirable residential district depreciate the value of surrounding property? Does the establishment of such an institution in a community have a depressing effect upon the persons residing in the immediate vicinity? Is there anything objectionable in the conduct of a well-managed, sanitary undertaking establishment in a residence that bears only a simple sign funeral home on its front to distinguish it from other homes? The residents of West Avenue have banded together to heartily declare that the presence of Miller's funeral home is not welcome in their neighborhood. Miller asserts his business is legitimate. With Judge Wickham presiding, we'll soon know who's right.
Order! Order in this court. The court will hear an opening statement from Frank Winter, attorney for the plaintiffs.
Thank you, Judge Wickham. When my clients moved into their homes, they found comfort in their proximity to West Avenue, the artery connecting La Crosse's north and south sides. They imagined happy days living among the city's wealthy and elite. The establishment of the Miller Brothers Funeral Home at 134 West Avenue South has darkened my clients' days, preventing them from living out the domestic dreams they once held so dear. Today, I will argue that the location of the undertaking establishment among the homes of the high society is not only harmful to the health and well-being of nearby residents, but also depreciates the value of priced real estate. You will now hear testimony from 2 neighbors of the Miller Brothers Funeral Home. I welcome Mrs. Elsie Giles Scott, owner of the Pasadena estate at 110 West Avenue.
My father built my palatial home Pasadena in 1888, and I've been proud to live there for over 30 years. The Platts homestead, now occupied by Mr. Miller, was built 4 years before our beloved Pasadena, and has always been a serene and stately neighbor. The Platts family children were splendid playmates for my own children, and I found it most agreeable to live alongside them. These days, I can no longer stand the harsh Midwest winters, so I spend the winter months at my home in Miami Beach. When I left last October, Mrs. Platts was still living in the home. Upon my return, Mr. Miller and his grotesque business has settled into the old Platts homestead. The moment I received word of the new establishment, I joined my neighbors in immediate protest. I find it deplorable that our neighborhood is now assaulted by thoughts of death and decay. Not only is the business unsightly, I can't help but fear the thought of, diseased bodies in the home next door. Why, Just 3 years ago, we learned of the dangers of contagion after being plagued by the Spanish flu. How can we allow the bodies of the sick and diseased to enter our serene and residential neighborhood?
There will be order in this court. Mr. Winter, you may continue.
Thank you, Judge Wickham, and thank you, Mrs. Scott. Now the court will hear from Thomas Woolley, also a resident of West Avenue.
Good day. My name is Thomas Woolley, and I live at 148 West Avenue, just south of Miller Funeral Home. For months, I have witnessed absolute horrors from my dining room window. Bodies wheeled in and out of the back door at all hours of the day. It's detestable. Now, I can tolerate frequent thoughts of death, but for my daughters Edith, Eden, and Elizabeth, the constant reminders of life's impermanence are far too much to bear. When I told them that an undertaking establishment would be located next door, they became hysterical. Poor girls. Just the other day, one of them had a fainting spell after catching a glimpse of one of those bodies. Aside from that, I reckon the value of my property has decreased 40 to 50% since the Millers set up shop next door.
Well put, Mr. Woolley. Your Honor, it's clear that the residents of West Avenue are most severely affected by the presence of Miller Brothers Funeral Home. My clients have demonstrated that Mr. Miller's establishment is a nuisance in every sense of the word. The neighborhood surrounding West Avenue has long been known to be purely residential, and it should remain as such. Here, I rest my case and ask you, Judge Wickham, to demand the removal of Miller Brothers Funeral Home.
Thank you, Attorney Winter. We will now hear from Attorney Jesse Higbee, representing the defendant, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Judge Wickham. I am here today representing Albert Miller, a man who has lived in La Crosse for all of his life and has been conducting a respectful funeral business for over 20 years. While I am not without my sympathies for the residents of the neighborhood in question, the fact stands that not a single law has been violated by my client. West Avenue is not zoned by city ordinance as an exclusively residential district, nor have any state laws been violated. The court will now hear Mr. Miller's testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Higbee. I spent my childhood in homes on La Crosse's Main Street, first near the river, then later just a few blocks from where I currently reside on West Avenue. I have always been fond of this neighborhood, and I often dreamed of one day owning one of the magnificent homes here. When my wife Sophia and I purchased the Platts homestead, it felt like that dream had come true. We worked tirelessly remodeling the home, installing a chapel on the main floor and refurnishing each room. Having earlier faced protests from some of these same neighbors when we attempted to buy a different home in the neighborhood for the same purpose, we were, of course, aware that our neighbors would not appreciate our presence. So we did our best to keep the realities of our business discreet. Our stock of caskets is kept in a room out of view of the street, and we only transport decedents through the rear entrance. Based on the testimonies I've heard from my neighbors today, I feel compelled to dispel a few myths about my practice. In the 6 months since I opened my establishment, we have had 8 funerals on the premises. While I understand the sometimes depressing effects of confronting death, I can assure you that my neighbors are only assaulted by its presence twice a month at most. Furthermore, in the cases of death from contagious diseases, we prepare the body from the place of death and take it straight to the cemetery. And we all know that Mrs. Scott's pungent horse stables do more to depreciate the value of our properties than my establishment. Miller Brothers Funeral Home is a fine mortuary, and we conduct our work in a proper and sanitary manner. I will not be bullied by these pompous aristocrats simply because they find my work disagreeable. We have a right to our property and its use, and I have no intention of vacating it nor abandoning my business.
After Miller's testimony, several expert witnesses were called to testify by the plaintiff's attorneys. Dr. J. L. Callahan declared that constant reminders of death might, quote, upset the nerves of neighbors, cause loss of sleep, harm their health, and bring about a 25% depreciation in property values. Upon cross-examination, Callahan admitted that the construction of a garage or stable house would similarly affect property values, as would the presence of a church. In 1921, there were 3 churches near the intersection of West Avenue and Main Streets. Moreover, Mrs. Scott, the owner of the Pasadena mansion, admitted that horses had been kept in the stable on her property, a factor that would also contribute to depreciating property values. Additionally, Miller's funeral home was in compliance with La Crosse zoning laws. Despite the outrage from Miller's high society neighbors, his opponents had failed to name one law that he had violated by establishing his funeral home on West Avenue. It seemed Judge Wickham couldn't possibly conclude that Miller's business was illegitimate. On July 28, 1921, Judge Wickham reported his decision.
I, Judge James Wickham, on the 28th day of July, 1921, order that the Miller Funeral Home cease its operations in the building at 134 West Avenue South. All plaintiffs in the case are to be awarded 6 cents in damages. I base my decision on the overly conspicuous nature of the funeral home's business. While Mr. Miller conducts his establishment in a sanitary manner, it is impossible to keep the same entirely free from flies and some offensive odors arising from the use of embalming fluids and the dissected bodies when autopsies are made. Furthermore, the establishment is located within an exclusively residential district, with no other businesses located within 5 blocks of the establishment. Each of the plaintiffs suffers damages due to the presence of Miller's business. Their homes have become less desirable, and their material value has depreciated. Maybe worst of all, they are confronted with feelings of dread due to fear of contagion, discomfort from the sights and sometimes smells related to the business, and depression from the constant reminder of death. Due to these factors, Mr. Miller's establishment is deemed a nuisance, and thus the business must be removed, and let the judgment be so entered.
Miller and his lawyers immediately announced an intent to appeal the case to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, allowing Miller to remain in the Platts homestead until his case was heard in the upper court in January of 1922. That judgment, based heavily on a previous Michigan State Supreme Court decision, is as follows. It requires no deep research in psychology to reach the conclusion that a constant reminder of death has a depressing influence upon the normal person. We think it is equally clear that maintenance of an undertaking and embalming establishment in a residential section must inevitably operate to decrease substantially property values, destroying the comfort and happiness of people residing in the immediate vicinity, and is an unwarrantable invasion of the rights of others. We, the justices of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, affirm the judgment of Judge Wickham. And with that, the Miller Brothers Funeral Home was forced out of the property at 134 West Avenue South, but AJ and Sophia still resided in the home. In 1923, Miller relocated his business to 306 Pearl Street, where it remained until his death in 1930. The building on Pearl Street was purchased by Haynes Funeral Home. Miller's funeral was held on June 10, 1930, and in a final act of rebellion, services were conducted from his home, 134 West Avenue South. Today, the block, once occupied by Miller's home and the Pasadena estate, is home to the Dahl Family YMCA. Pasadena was raised in 1967, and construction on the new YMCA building began the same year. During construction, the house at 134 West Avenue South was used as a temporary headquarters for the YMCA. Now, the YMCA building dominates the 100 block of West Avenue South. Interestingly, the YMCA Wellness Center features a wall of windows providing a wonderful view of Shoemaker Kish funeral and cremation services just across King Street. And now I'd like to welcome in Megan Hafling, Associate Librarian at the La Crosse Public Library Archives, who did some of the initial research for this story.
Between 1919 and 1922, when our story takes place, there were 9 undertakers listed in the La Crosse City Directory. Most undertakers were listed as individuals, though a few worked for larger funeral homes, like the Miller Brothers Funeral Home, Tillman Brothers, or Tetley, Sletton, and Dahl. For some of these undertakers, providing funeral services was really more of a side gig than a full-time business venture. For example, one 1922 advertisement reads, "Dealers in furniture, rugs, linoleums, curtains, stoves and ranges, picture frames, etc." Beneath this list, in smaller text, the ad reads, "Undertaking and embalming." This kind of funeral home furniture store mashup likely stems from a 19th century tradition of carpenters building coffins for the dead. Their woodworking skills translated nicely into casket making, and this tradition continued into the 1920s. The two industries had mostly separated by the mid-20th century, though many funeral homes and furniture stores continue to operate under the same family name. Funerals in the 1920s looked pretty similar to funerals today. Funerals included a service, which often took place in the home of the deceased or occasionally in a church. Services were attended by friends and loved ones, and those unable to attend would send telegrams, letters, and floral arrangements to extend their sympathies. After the funeral service, a smaller group of funeral goers would attend the burial or interment, typically on the same day as the funeral. Pallbearers were chosen to carry the casket from the hearse to the grave. These were usually relatives or close friends of the deceased. In terms of ceremony, this is all very similar to the American funeral practices we have today. However, in the 1920s, the role of a funeral director hadn't quite been established. Most of those involved in funeral work considered themselves to be undertakers, and their primary responsibilities were in the embalming and care of the deceased body. Beginning in the 1930s, more funeral services were held in funeral homes, and funeral directors began selling a complete funeral experience. This included directorial services, a casket, the preparation of the deceased, dressing and personal care, the procurement of any necessary permits, and transportation of the body to and from the funeral home. As time went on, funeral homes began adding on more services, such as floral arrangements and specialized burial vaults. The funeral business became a lucrative one. In the 1960s, large corporations bought up family-owned funeral homes and offered ever more expensive services. These corporations began selling a more dignified way to die, and the American way of death as we know it today was born. Despite this national trend, the funeral homes in La Crosse remain predominantly family-owned. Funeral homes like Dickinson Family Funeral Home, Blaschke and Schneider Funeral Homes, and Shoemaker Kish Funeral and Cremation Services have all been family-owned and operated for decades. Perhaps the large corporations never found their way to La Crosse, or maybe the family-owned funeral homes simply refused to sell. Because of this, funeral homes in La Crosse have remained relatively unchanged for the past 60 years, although some funeral homes have adapted their services to fit the needs of the La Crosse community. In the late 1970s, the first Hmong refugees arrived in La Crosse after fleeing persecution for aiding the United States during the Vietnam War. When the Hmong came to La Crosse, they brought along their cultural practices, including their beliefs about death and funerals. I spoke with members of the Hmong Cultural and Community Agency who taught me more about their funeral practices. The Hmong believe in life after death, and when someone dies, their soul must be guided through the ancestral world before being reincarnated. This process takes time. Most Hmong funerals last anywhere from 1 to 4 days, and services continue throughout the day and night. During the funeral, the deceased is accompanied by a spiritual guide who helps the soul to find its ancestors. The soul is guided using chants and songs played on a bamboo instrument called a gang. During their journey, the deceased is fed by community members. Food plays a major role in Hmong funerals, and meals are prepared throughout the entirety of the service. Hmong funerals are community affairs. Each funeral is organized by a team of community and family members. People are assigned roles, which include solving any problems that may arise during the service, playing the gang for the deceased, preparing food, and keeping track of paperwork or donations from community members. When the Hmong began holding funerals in La Crosse, they typically went to Dickinson Family Funeral Home. However, because of the length of the funerals and a lack of a kitchen in the Dickinson facility, the Hmong community needed their own space to conduct funeral services. In 1998, the Imperial Restaurant on Ward Avenue was purchased by the Dickinson brothers with plans to hold Hmong memorial services there. The building was later purchased by the Hmong Cultural and Community Agency, and Hmong funerals are still held there today. Thanks for listening.